Breaking news, everybody. This is Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here. And of course, I'm joined by author and economic analyst here at WAM, John Sneisen. And some big stories, a run on the bank, the suspension of withdrawals. Let's go into this story, John, out of Latvia, as Latvia calls emergency meeting after third largest bank fails. And as this article from Reuters goes into, Latvian authorities will gather for an emergency meeting on Monday following the failure of the country's third largest bank, the Prime Minister said on Saturday, as the country kept watch for any followed on other banks. And if further goes into, accused by U.S. authorities of large-scale money laundering, ABLV scrambled this week to come up with a survival plan, but failed as customers fled and management could not come up with sufficient cash despite offers of emergency central bank liquidity. And of course, there was a suspension of withdrawals. And, John was going into before we started this video, it's like a bank holiday on a weekend. Surprise, surprise. This is really big. This is the inevitable end of many of the big banks. And just going further into it, just recently, the Latvian central bank governor accused banks of trying to oust him after there's a big investigation. Now, of course, I'm not against people hiding their money from government in any case. But of course, it's always interesting. It's the people that attack others, governments and banks that'll attack others for, hiding their hard-earned money from government. But when they do it, it's totally A-okay. What do you think, John?
First of all, it's people that are working in the government that have stole our money in the first place, and then they're hiding it. So I don't like that. But anyways, we need to go back to, so ABLV is the third biggest bank in Latvia. Now, there's, of course, contagion now, and they're talking about the depletion of capital. So what you got to understand, I did 3 reports lately, one on the Canadian banks, cash holdings versus deposits. Then I did one on the credit unions in Canada, but I also did one on the biggest banks in the world, JP Morgan, a whole bunch of others. Now, looking at the numbers, which is very interesting here. So looking at, I pulled the numbers from their balance sheets, the big 4 banks in Latvia, and what I found was ABLV, they had 13.36% cash versus deposits, which is actually very, very, very good compared to the banks that are out there, like the big ones, JP Morgan, RBC, Swiss, all these big banks. And then, of course, I wanted to show you the other numbers here. We got Norvik Banka, which is actually a Norwegian-owned bank that are in several Baltic countries. They have a 4.73% deposit cash to deposit ratio. So that's actually under 60% of what ABLV that just failed had. So they're looking for contagion. There's a lot of risk there. Actually, the banks, the 4 biggest banks are way well capitalized compared to European, world banks, and also especially the Canadian banks that are some of the worst in the world. Take a look at this, like 24.59% at Citadeli Banka, and then Riatumu has 28.85. So that's a lot of cash versus deposits compared to other ones. So it's still like nothing really, like it's still under than 30%. But what this is, there's a run on the bank, they're depleting the cash reserves, which is what keeps the bank insolvent. And that's what's happening here. They're just sucking out all the cash. People are taking out the deposits that are not theirs, but they're taking them out and actually getting possession of them back again.
Well, absolutely. And it's absolutely insane because this is going to affect so many people. And this is why, the banking system is so inefficient. If your money's in the bank, it's not yours, it's the bank's. And, this is a big reason why they're trying to unroll a centrally planned cashless society as well, because, there can't be a run on a bank. There's bail-in regimes. And then, of course, the depositor's insurance is cut right out of the picture and no one can do anything about it. They're essentially enslaved to the banking system. And then, as this BCS article also says, Latvia's ABLV receives emergency central bank loan and suspends withdrawals. And going into this, the ECB's response to all of this. John, can you go into what's going on there?
Yeah, well, the ECB is looking at this bank as not really systemically important anymore. They're actually looking at just say like, hey, we're just going to leave this bank alone, let it fail, create a failed bank kind of setup that they did in Cyprus, in Greece, and so on, where they have a bank that basically is a zombie bank that you're never going to get your money back. It's like all the deposits gets put into shares, as an example, and then those shares, you own shares in a failed bank. So
woohoo!
Yeah, exactly. So
way rather that than my Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's people need to understand here that the ECB they were just looking at this bank and say, hey, we don't really care about this bank. It's too small to have any effect. To actually us wanting to bail it out. They were looking at that with their fund that they have, the ECB, but that didn't happen. It looks like what's going to happen is the same thing that happened in Greece with a couple of banks there, and of course Larnaca and Bank of Cyprus in 2013 when there was bail-ins that happened. We don't know yet. Like there probably might be some recapitalization, as they call it, which is bail-ins that will happen.
A lot of manipulation.
Yeah. So people that thought that they had their deposit insured, surprised with that deposit insurance. People need to understand this. This deposit insurance is a fraud. And then, of course, you thinking that you have your money and you own it in the bank is a fraud. The fractional reserve lending system is a fraud. And it's coming out. It's slowly coming out. We're seeing like more and more small little bank runs here and there now, Josh. This is just the symptoms of something way bigger to come, which we will see. Look at like the numbers was 13% of cash reserves they had in 2016 on their last annual report. ABLV bank. Well, now I can only imagine what they have, but you need to look at the big banks. Look at Canada. Canada is so high risk right now. You're looking at a lot of banks that are under 5% to like TD, for example, looking at 13.38.
Toronto Dominion.
Yeah, they had only 0.45% of their deposits in cash.
But what place isn't risky at this point in the entire world? Because I mean, the way that we've become so dependent on the banking system is really quite sickening, because people just depend on the banks to really get them their retirement, just depend on the banks to save their money invested wisely, which of course banks don't do, crazy out of control derivatives, manipulation, etc. And of course, this isn't the old fashioned kind of bank that, we see in It's a Wonderful Life. This is a totally different kind of system.
Yeah, well, back in the day, they had savings and loan banks, and they had that until the savings and loan crisis in the 80s, when they actually deregulated banks so they could actually become savings loan banks and investment banks. That's what they are now. They have their savings loans, their deposits, and then they borrow money out, leveraging versus, we call it fractional reserve banking it, to borrow money out to people that have business loans, car loans, house loans, and so on. But today, these banks are actively investing and creating derivatives. We haven't looked too much into the derivative exposure of this ABLV bank, but what we do know is that the contagion could suddenly just start to happen everywhere, because you had some derivatives that were connected to that, and then 100 banks holds these derivatives, and then suddenly they start failing. It's like a domino effect, and we see this everywhere. We look at 2008, what the fallout, though, $13 billion of failures in mortgages was in the United States that caused havoc all over the world, and you had massive failures.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will be keeping a close look on what is happening at ABLV. It's absolutely insane, John. We've been reporting on this stuff for a long time, and we've seen a lot of this coming. And I just really hope that people become more independent, self-sustainable. Responsibility is a hallmark of freedom itself, and people have to break free from this paradigm. But John, bottom line for this report?
People need to educate themselves about what a bank is, what it does, how it works, because if you don't, you're going to be like the depositors at ABLV that are panicking right now, because they're going to lose probably a lot of their money that they had invested, deposited in the bank, thinking that it was theirs. It's all about education, and this is what happens when people are not educated. They believe they have the trust that the bank always have the money available for them at any given time, and this could so fast happen. And as I said, here in Canada, we're way worse than this ABLV bank. So people need to really understand. And this is, of course, our opinion, but we do a lot of research here at MAM. I've been looking at all these balance sheets from over 40, 50 banks now, and I'm starting to just get a grasp of what's happening with them, and especially when it comes to the cash, because that's what's important, where people need to take out cash versus deposits. That's what people need to look at. So yeah, look at the Steemit articles that I have out on it. Josh could probably share it so you can see it here, but take a look at those to get an understanding of what's happening with ABLV.
Absolutely. And we'll be back to you with many more reports, etc. But right now, we're just trying to get as many interviews as we did down in Acapulco, Mexico recently. So stay tuned for a lot more big interviews coming your way as well. We were working hard constantly in the beautiful climate of Acapulco, Mexico. And now we're stuck in the snowy Winnipeg, Canada. But we're going to be getting out there again. And I've got a lot more events I'm planning in the near future. I'm going to keep you up to date on that. And until next time, thanks for going into this with us, John. This is Josh Sigurdson and John Sneisen signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.